Welcome to Cook the Garden Podcast, your weekly audio source for delicious and easy garden fresh recipes and growing tips. I'm your host, Janine Grays. Let's cook the garden. Hello, friends. Welcome back to Cook the Garden Podcast. If you have a slow cooker, you're going to love today's episode. And even if you don't, you'll probably want one after today. But don't worry, I'll share an alternative way to make today's recipe using the stovetop method as well. So today we're diving into making my delicious and easy crock-pot Caribbean beef stew. So this stew is packed with flavor and perfect for using up leftover ingredients and, of course, using those fresh produce items from your garden or local farmer's market. Now, I've been seeing a whole lot of these beef stew recipes using those high in sodium, really salty stew packets. Have you all seen those as well? So those contain so much sodium and honestly ingredients that I can't even pronounce. But this recipe, you're not getting any of that. We're using fresh veggies, herbs, spices, all of that to create delicious, big, bold flavors with a Caribbean twist. So growing up in a Caribbean household, everything we ate had a little taste of home. This recipe is no different. The flavors from the ginger, the soy sauce, allspice, and of course, a little bit of heat from the peppers. It really does go a long way and it makes a huge difference in the flavor. The great thing about this recipe is that you can switch up the ingredients based off of seasons. And so we're using baby potatoes, but during the fall, you might want to switch it out for some sweet potatoes. So it's really versatile, and potatoes are just such an easy produce to grow, and it has a creamy texture and really pairs well with the beef and the Caribbean flavors and spices. Other ingredients like thyme, ginger, and allspice all add just complexity and warmth to the stew. And of course, the heat from the peppers, it just sets it off. So you guys are absolutely going to love this recipe. One of the best things about it is that it's so simple to prepare. Just toss all of the ingredients into a slow cooker and let it do its magic. It's perfect for those busy weeknights when you don't have a lot of time to spend in the kitchen. And if you have leftovers, they make great meal prep for the rest of the week. So later in the episode, I'll share some tips on how to grow the most delicious potatoes. But in the meantime, let's jump into the recipe. For the ingredients, we'll start with about 2 pounds of beef stew meat cut into 1-inch cubes, 1 tablespoon of oil. In this case, you can use your favorite oil. You can use olive oil, canola oil, or vegetable oil. 1 large onion diced, 4 cloves of garlic minced, 1 tablespoon of garlic powder, 1 tablespoon of onion powder, 1 tablespoon of paprika, 1 tablespoon of ground cumin, 1 teaspoon dried thyme, 1 teaspoon of ground allspice, 1/2 teaspoon of cinnamon, 1/4 teaspoon of cayenne pepper, 1 can of diced tomatoes, 1 cup of beef broth, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce, 1 tablespoon of soy sauce or tamari sauce, a handful of halved baby potatoes, 2 cups of diced carrots, 1/2 cup of celery chopped, 1 teaspoon of grated fresh ginger or 1/2 teaspoon of dried ginger powder, salt and pepper to taste, and I always use a hot pepper such as a Scotch bonnet or a habanero. That's completely optional. If you don't like the spice, you can definitely leave the pepper out of this recipe. First, we'll start by washing and prepping your meat, and then you're going to marinate it with your soy sauce or your tamari sauce. And then you're going to add your cayenne pepper, your garlic powder, and onion powder. Let it marinate overnight or for at least a couple of hours. Then you're going to heat the oil in a large skillet over medium hot heat. Add the beef stew meat and cook that until it's nicely browned on all sides. I would say that would take about 5 to 6 minutes. Then you're going to transfer the beef to your slow cooker. Add your onion, celery, carrots, garlic, and your ginger to the slow cooker. Add the diced tomatoes, beef broth, your brown sugar, and your Worcestershire sauce. Now you're going to add your paprika, your cumin, thyme, allspice, and cinnamon. Then you'll cook on low for about 8 to 10 hours, or you can also cook it on high for 4 to 6 hours. During the last 1 to 2 hours of cooking, go ahead and add the baby potatoes and season it with salt and pepper to taste. If you want extra heat, go ahead and add that hot pepper. When it's done cooking, you can go ahead and serve it hot and enjoy. Like I mentioned earlier, if you have any leftovers, these are great for meal prepping or freezing it for another time. One question I get all the time when I share this recipe is, can you make this on the stovetop using a regular pot? And the answer is absolutely you can. You'll still prep your meat and marinate it as you would the original recipe, and you're going to go ahead and brown your meat as well in that same pot. So you'll brown the meat for 5 to 7 minutes, set that aside just like you would do for the original recipe, and then you'll bring in your veggies and you're going to go ahead and saute your veggies up. That includes your onion, your celery, carrots, garlic, ginger. And then once you have sauteed those up for, I would say about 3 to 4 minutes, when they start to become fragrant, you'll add in your wet ingredients such as the diced tomatoes and your beef broth, and you'll add your spices, your paprika, your cumin, the thyme, allspice. You'll add all of that and you'll get it up to a boil. And once you get it up to a boil, lower the heat and just let it slow cook. This will give the meat an opportunity to just become tender. And you want to cook it for a good 1 to 2 hours. Just check on the meat and make sure that you're checking to see the tenderness of the meat. You're going to go ahead and towards the end of the cooking process, I would say within the last 30 minutes or so, you'll add your baby potatoes and you'll add your salt and pepper to taste. And that's it. Basically, same concept. You want to slow cook it. You want to make sure the meat becomes nice and tender and all of those flavors just marry together and just create a delicious stew. So I hope that helps. You can also use substitutions. So let me go into this a little bit. I'm always asked about substituting a few of the ingredients in this stew. And honestly, it's all about personal preference and your dietary restrictions. So here are a few possible substitutions that you could do for this stew. As far as the beef stew meat, you can use any other type of beef that's suitable for slow cooking, such as chuck roast or even a brisket. If you also wanted to use a different type of meat, you can use lamb or even pork. So as far as the potatoes, I think I mentioned this earlier. You can also use sweet potatoes or butternut squash. Those are really great to switch it out when the seasons switch. So it's really nice if you want to put, like a seasonal twist to it. That butternut squash, the sweet potatoes, they're just terrific. And they also provide a really delicious flavor. As far as the carrots, you can use other types of root vegetables such as parsnips, turnips, or rutabagas. You can also use frozen mixed vegetables instead of fresh carrots as well. Instead of the beef broth, you can also use chicken broth or a vegetable broth instead of the beef. You can also use water and adjust the seasonings accordingly. For brown sugar, you can use honey. You can also use maple syrup or even agave nectar. Instead of using the brown sugar, you can also remove the sweetener altogether. And as far as the soy sauce goes, I also mentioned this earlier. You can use a tamari sauce or even coconut aminos if you're looking for a gluten-free or a soy-free option. All right, guys, so I'm going to stop right there. I have an entire blog post dedicated to this recipe, so I'll go ahead and put that link in the show notes for your reference. Earlier, I teased some gardening tips for you guys to be able to grow your own baby potatoes. So let's jump into that. So there are several methods for growing potatoes. I have my favorite, which is the container gardening. I've grown potatoes in grow bags. And with container gardening, basically the potatoes can be grown in a large container or grow bags filled with soil. This method is especially useful for those of us with limited gardening space, or even it makes it a lot easier actually to harvest your potatoes when they're ready. And for me, soil has been quite an issue in my area. So utilizing the containers and grow bags has been really helpful for me as well. Raised beds are also a really great way to grow potatoes. This is my second favorite method of growing the potatoes. I have raised beds. All of my gardening is actually done in raised beds. For potatoes, though, you do need to have a deeper bed, and so that's why I prefer the containers, because they're a little deeper. But for the raised beds, again, you're growing the potatoes in the raised bed, which allows for better soil drainage, and it makes it easier to control the soil temperature and moisture levels. So those are a few more reasons why I actually prefer the raised beds and container gardening methods for potatoes. You can also do straw or hay bale gardening, which I haven't ventured into yet. I may actually try that this year. But this involves planting seed potatoes in bales of straw or hay. It's a really great option for those with poor soil quality or limited garden space as well. So I've been talking to a few people who've actually had really great success with the straw or hay bale gardening. So I'm really intrigued, and I'll be doing more research on that. And then, of course, you've got your traditional planting in ground, which involves, planting seed potatoes directly into the ground in rows or in hills. This method requires good soil, definitely good soil preparation, regular watering, deep watering, and hilling the plants as they grow. So again, lots of options here for growing potatoes. Definitely let me know if you've been successful and what method is your favorite, what you've done, and what are some of the pros and cons that you've run into growing potatoes. So my biggest tip actually involves harvesting time. So when you harvest your baby potatoes, you want to make sure that you're harvesting them at the right time. And I know sometimes that can be a little bit tricky, especially when you're really anxious to get your new harvest of baby potatoes. But they're ready to harvest when the plants start to die back a little and the foliage turns yellow. So once you notice that the turning of the foliage and they're becoming yellow, carefully dig up the potatoes. Be really careful not to damage them. And that's my biggest tip. I remember the first time I grew potatoes in a grow bag, and I was just so excited, and I harvested them a little too soon. So definitely make sure that the foliage is starting to die back. And once you notice that, they're good to go. And just be super careful when you do harvest them to not damage them, because baby potatoes are a little more delicate and they're easier to damage if you're not careful. So that's my biggest growing tip for growing baby potatoes. I really hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Definitely check out the show notes, where I included a full link to the entire recipe as well as a few resources for growing potatoes. If you haven't had a chance yet, definitely check out our new Facebook group called Cook the Garden Recipes and Growing Tips. I share lots of growing tips. I share a lot of what I'm doing in my own garden, and I love to bring our conversations from the podcast into this community. So you are more than welcome to join us in our Facebook group at Cook the Garden Recipes and Growing Tips. Let's also connect on Instagram. In between episodes, you can connect with me there at Cook the Garden. This was a fun episode. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you did too. Have a great week, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to this week's Cook the Garden. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a 5-star review. As a new podcast, it really helps to add value while growing our awesome community. As always, I really appreciate it. Until next time, friends, keep slaying those garden fresh recipes.